Now, I want to take you live now to central London because we're expecting any minute now to hear from Nigel Farage, who's launching the Brexit Party's election policies. They've just been showing a short video there to the assembled crowd.
Please welcome to the stage.
Could be the moment.
Nigel Farage.
There we are. Good timing. Let's listen in.
Well, good morning, thank you. This is not a manifesto, because a word association test with manifesto gave us the word lie. And is that any surprising given just how many broken promises we've seen in British politics over the last few general elections? No, manifestos are a means of telling people what they want to hear without ever having the genuine desire to implement them. So it is a contract with the people, and these are the policies that not only will we campaign on over the course of the next 3 weeks, but we'll campaign on these in the years to come. Already, just 8 months into our existence, we've already changed the landscape of political politics, and we will change it very much more greatly in the years to come. We're told that this is the Brexit election, and yet there's been almost no discussion on the withdrawal agreement or the terms of Brexit whatsoever. Though I have to say, the debate the other night did expose the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's party absolutely refused to answer which side they would campaign on in their second referendum. And for us, it's perfectly clear that there are 5 million Labour Leave voters who have been absolutely betrayed by the Labour Party. And after 3.5 years of failure from a Conservative government, I have to say that when I saw Boris Johnson's so-called deal, I was less than impressed. It simply was not Brexit. And I was struck again by the number of people who spoke, saying they supported it without ever actually having read it. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Boris did indicate a change of direction. He said we will leave in 2020, but more significantly, that he's going to negotiate a super Canada plus deal without alignment. And that is progress, because if we leave the European Union and we find ourselves aligned in everything from financial services to fisheries, we have not actually left. So we took that promise and we said, OK, on the basis of that, we will concentrate our firepower against Labour and against the Remainers. And that is exactly what we are doing. Be in no doubt, we want a clean break from the political institutions of the EU. And you can get that with a Canada-style trade deal, just as you can get it leaving on WTO terms. I have to say that we will be looking at the Conservative Manifesto when it's launched on Sunday and reading the words in it very carefully indeed. We need the Brexit Party to hold Boris Johnson to his word. We need the Brexit Party voice there in the House of Commons, or we're not going to get anything like what we voted for 3.5 years ago. And there are 130 seats up and down the country that the Conservatives have never won and never will win. There are a lot of Labour voters who just cannot and will not ever bring themselves to vote Conservative, but they will vote for us. They showed that in the European elections, and they're showing it now, and we are now beginning to dig into that old Labour vote, which puts us in our key target seats in a position where we can get over the line in some of them. And as for splitting the vote, the argument that was doing the rounds a few weeks ago, just as it did, incidentally, when I led UKIP back in 2015, arguably in many of the Tories' key target seats, we're actually making it rather easier for them because we're picking up Labour votes that would never ever go to the Conservatives. But Brexit for us is just the beginning, not the end, of a much needed political revolution. Never before in this country has public confidence in politics, politicians, our electoral systems ever been lower than it is today. And the Brexit Party are the party of the new radicals. That is who we are. We want to bring politics and our democracy into the 21st century. We genuinely do want to change politics for good. And that begins with a voting system that is hopelessly out of date, suitable perhaps when there are just two parties fighting elections, but it doesn't work anymore, leads to millions of people feeling, what is the point of voting at all? And it also leads, I think, to very negative politics. It leads to, you think we're bad? Look at the other guy. He's even worse. I do think a degree of proportionality in the system would see parties campaigning on a much more positive agenda. And I'm astonished that nobody seems to want to reform the postal voting system, something that has been totally abused since it was opened up nearly 20 years ago. We've seen fraud, intimidation, several court cases, people going to prison, and yet it seems to suit the two parties to keep the postal voting system as it is. We would scrap the register in its entirety and go back to basics. If you work abroad or you're infirm, you can register for a postal vote. And of course, the reason that the big head-to-head debates, all the big policy launches are taking place this week is because postal votes go out over the course of this weekend, and by next Wednesday, 25% or more of this election will actually be over. That's why this is such a crucial time. We want to reform that. And we are sickened in many ways by the system of political patronage that we see in this country. Frankly, I do think the way appointments to the House of Lords and indeed other honours are used borders on corruption, and the House of Lords now is no longer fit for purpose, and we think it needs to go. What 2016 showed us is that if you give people the chance to speak, they will. We saw a massive turnout and a result that surprised pretty much everybody. And it says to me that citizens should be able to call referendums on key issues if there is a fundamental disconnect between what is happening in Westminster and what is happening out in the country. And we would propose a citizens' initiative, an ability where if 5 million people sign a valid register, they're able to get a referendum on an issue of their choice. But that's political reform. We also have some problems deep, I think, within our institutions, and in particular, a highly politicised civil service, something that was unthinkable 20 years ago, as we prided ourselves as being the one country in the world that genuinely had a neutral, independent civil service. Certainly in the last 3.5 years, that, I'm afraid, has been exposed. And we do believe that people working for the civil service should sign a pledge of political neutrality. That would be a very good place to start. There's also some real thinking got to go on about the Supreme Court. I mean, it is a political court, and it's acting without any guidelines whatsoever. So I think we're going to have, and this won't be easy, it'll take years, but I think we are going to have a constitutional convention working out just what sort of written code, just what sort of written constitution there needs to be in this country, so that firstly, no referendum in the future can be said to be not legally binding. They all told us it was, of course. They would implement the result. But later they tell us that actually that wasn't constitutional. And secondly, as I say, the Supreme Court needs to have some political guidelines to work from. And the BBC is another huge institution in this country, which frankly, in a modern age of consumer choice and streaming, has become an anachronism. I do understand that it's an important global brand for this country, but I would propose that we phase out the licence fee over a period of time. In all of those things that I've just said, as leader of the New Radicals, none of those things will happen with the Conservative and Labour parties. They don't want any fundamental change or reform to the system at all, and I detect there's a big change of mood out there in the country. This is something that will become part of the mainstream debate. Whether it's over the next 3 weeks or whether it's in time, I don't know the answer, but the need and desire for political and institutional reform is enormous. Now, on the night of the referendum, I was about 30 yards away from here in the bar at Reels at 3:10 in the morning when it became clear that the Leave vote was going to win. And that next morning, I was on College Green and I said that this had been the victory for the little people. Well, as yet, 3.5 years on, there's been nothing for the little people, nothing for the ordinary people whatsoever, as our politics and our debate around the economy continues to be dominated by giant corporate global business. So we're going to put forward some ideas that we're going to campaign on that would help ordinary people, the little people in our country. We want to cut the cost of living. And a very good place to start, and again, you can't do this unless you have a clean break Brexit from the European institutions, but a very good place to start this would be to remove VAT on domestic fuel bills. That would save the average family in this country £65 a year. And we would like to reduce the family food bill, the family clothing bill, the family footwear bill. I mean, over 20% of foodstuffs that we buy in our shops come in from outside the European Union and, of course, have tariff put on them. So we can use Brexit as a means to help the consumer, use Brexit to help the average family. But, of course, I must emphasise again, you can only do these things if you're outside the European Union's customs union. And we do want to invest very much in our left-behind coastal communities. Many of the areas of highest deprivation in Britain are in our coastal towns and communities, and that of course means we've got to get back that 200-mile or the median line exclusive economic zone. That can lead to great regeneration in some of the most deprived areas of our country. I came into this from business. I worked for big firms, but equally I set up my own small firm. I ran it for 9 years. There's virtually nobody sitting on the front benches of either party who has ever set up their own business or realised just how difficult that has become in the modern world. And we are the party for small business and for small people. We need, post leaving the European Union, to try to lift the regulatory burden that is there on small businesses. If the FSB are right, and if the average small employer is now spending between 20 and 25% of their week on compliance, that's an awful lot of time that is lost to productivity, wealth creation and job creation. And we propose quite an important but radical change to corporation tax. 1 million companies, that's 2/3 of all registered companies in this country, do not make more than £10,000 a year. A lot of them are new start-up companies. And we propose introducing a £10,000 threshold at which corporation tax begins to be paid. It'll take a big weight off the mind of many struggling small companies. It won't be so good for the accountants, and I understand that, but when you think of the cost of going to an accountant, registering, paying a very small amount of income tax, you probably get a bill from the accountant bigger than the amount of tax you send to the Exchequer. And similarly, what does it cost HMRC to collect tiny amounts of money from hundreds of thousands of companies? And that, I think, would be a real victory for the little people. As Jake mentioned, in the European election campaign, we started to talk about the need for regional investment, that not everything in this country should just be about London. And I'm pleased that in many ways we've kicked off that debate, because that is now being talked about by the Conservative Party. It is being talked about by the Labour Party. And yes, of course, we're talking about digital infrastructure. We're talking, of course, about the need, very much huge need for transport links. We're even talking in many parts of the UK about a lack of mobile phone connectivity. So yes, there's an argument to make big investments in the regions. But unlike all the others in this campaign of promises, where 100 billion here, 200 billion there are being thrown around by the Labour and Conservative parties. Indeed, I think so far an election campaign in which nobody believes anything they're being told in terms of promises. And when people are surveyed, they can't even remember what those promises were. Well, we're going to put on the table an idea of how we could pay for much of this. Pay for schemes that will benefit many millions, not just a few. And HS2 strikes us as being a project which actually will benefit just a few thousand people, costing at least 100 billion sterling, and we would want to save that money. We, of course, would want to stop sending 13 billion every single year to the European Union. We'd want to claim back the £7 billion that, incredibly, Philip Hammond just left on the table at the European Investment Bank, and the foreign aid budget, so much of which is spent to simply meet political targets, so much of which is spent in ways that we would not approve of. We propose cutting the foreign aid budget. All in all, you see there savings of 200 billion sterling. As I say, the others will tell you how they're going to spend money, not how they're going to fund ideas. We're telling you how we will actually fund ideas. On that morning of the 24th of June, one of the issues that disappeared off the radar of British politics was immigration. It had been the dominant issue every year for the previous 5 years, the thing that people were talking about. And I think with the Brexit vote, people thought, well, that's it. It's done. It's sorted. It's all over. Well, take us to this election where certainly the Labour Party conference appear to want to open up the doors pretty unconditionally, and where the Labour Manifesto makes it very clear that foreign nationals coming into the country will, of course, get the vote. It would appear pretty much immediately. Now, from the Conservatives, well, I've been saying for years we need an Australian-style point system, and at least they're now saying that. But of course, they make absolutely no commitment whatsoever to reducing numbers. And the truth of it is, they've got no intention to reduce numbers. Many of their big business backers want as much cheap labour as they can possibly get into this country. We have a population crisis directly as a result of policies since the late 1990s, and you see that not just on the impact on public services, but actually there's an argument here about the quality of life. There's an argument here that as we inexorably head towards 70 million people being here by the end of the next decade, that actually that does damage to people's lives, to people's communities. You cannot measure how content a country is by simply looking at GDP numbers. There is such a thing as society and community, and I think that has too much been ignored. So we would very much want to get immigration numbers down to what for 60 years were very acceptable and very workable post-war levels. And yes, I'm talking around about 50,000 people every year. But of course, we're going to need flexibility on work permits. But please recognise the difference between the automatic right to settle and the right to come and work for a time-limited period. And it also leads in, I've met so many people running businesses, running engineering companies, indeed people at hospitals, saying we just in this country do not train enough of our own people. And again, this is long term. It's going to take more than a couple of years to turn this around, but we do need to invest in our own people. On illegal immigration, well, I think we probably need to do something to stop the human tragedy we saw in the back of that lorry the other week with 39 dead people. But even today, there are boats coming across the English Channel, and we all know that the Border Force bring them in to Dover. They're kept by the police for 24 hours, and then virtually everybody disappears. No one seems to think it matters. In fact, the Prime Minister is on record several times in the past supporting amnesties for illegal immigrants. We think that is heading in the wrong direction. We think a strong message that says if you come here illegally across the channel or in the back of a container that you won't be allowed to stay will prevent further human tragedy. And it's the right thing to do. On big areas of debate like the National Health Service, well, just don't believe the lies that Labour say, whether it's about us wanting to privatise the health service or Donald Trump wanting to buy it, none of it actually is true. And we are, of course, committed to it, and it will need more money. With a rapidly expanding population, it will need more money, though I am struck, if you actually listen to what all the party leaders say on the National Health Service, they're all aiming for the same outcome. If ever there was an issue that should be depoliticised and where parties could perhaps work together, I'm struck that it could be in an area like health. Now, there's many other things I'm talking about in here. We're talking about the environment particularly, which has risen up the agenda. And I have to say, the sheer hypocrisy of governments and a parliament that talks about recycling but is only too happy for hundreds of thousands of tonnes of our waste to go to landfill sites in China or to be dumped at sea strikes us as being a nonsense that needs to be stopped. And everybody talks about reducing CO2 output. And that's not an easy thing to do without deindustrialising the country. Clearly, we're trying to make progress, but we've got to recognise that when it comes to CO2 production, we are less than 2% of global output. But there's been too little talk about CO2 absorption. And I've been campaigning for a few months now on the idea that trees provide a significant part of the answer. But I don't think that planting tens of millions of trees just here in the United Kingdom, well, it might be good for biodiversity, yes, but it's not going to make a big difference. Here's an example of a policy where we should become a global leader. Here's an idea of a policy where we should go to the United Nations, speak to some of the big governments that we know in America and elsewhere, and let's lead a global initiative. Let's aim to plant hundreds of billions of trees over the course of the next decade. Something practical, something sensible that we can do. There's much else in this document. We cover pretty much every area of British domestic life and indeed our role in the international community. We have already changed the face of British politics. Without us, there will be no genuine Brexit. We now want to lead the next phase, which is a political revolution that puts the ordinary people first. Thank you.
There we are, Nigel Farage launching not, as he called it, his party's manifesto, but rather a contract with the British people and laying out his vision for what the Brexit Party would do for the country. Let's listen to the questions now coming from journalists and those assembled to hear that launch.
Christopher over here. Start with Chris Hope. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Chris Hope,
sorry.
Nigel, Chris Hope, Telegraph. 3 quick questions. By allowing referendums for anyone signing more than 5 million people, aren't you inadvertently allowing a second EU referendum if you have any control over government policy? What's your evidence for saying that you're making gains in Labour seats? Is that after Labour's manifesto was published or before? And what's the point of your manifesto if you can't actually win the election? You're only standing 274 candidates.
On the first point, we make the point about citizens' initiatives that the same subject could not be re-examined within the space of a 10-year period. Okay, that's in there. On your point about Labour, look, this is before the launch of their manifesto. We can see where we're putting the effort in. We are picking up Labour votes and going up in the polls. In some constituencies, that now puts us within touching distance of the incumbent Labour MP with nearly 3 weeks to go. In other areas, the mathematics is pretty clear. It's probably helping the Conservatives, actually, in some of those seats. And you will remember that, we had these same conversations when I led UKIP back in 2015, that the accusation was that UKIP would split the vote. It would lead to an SNP Ed Miliband coalition. And when we saw the scores on the doors, actually we realised that the UKIP vote had hurt Labour far more than it had hurt the Conservatives. And we're seeing much the same thing again.
Lead the agenda.
The Liberal Democrats have not won an election for over 100 years. They still put out a manifesto. The minor parties put out manifestos. We're not putting out a manifesto. This is a contract with the people. The word manifesto has been tainted. And I would argue... I would argue that over the years, maybe what I've been quite good at, and what we've been very good at in the few months we've existed, we are good at changing the national debate. We've done it in a number of areas. Mark my words, the desire and the need for radical political change, both with our electoral system and with our institutions, is going to be a huge issue in British politics for years to come, and we are beginning that revolution today.
James from PA. James Cropper, I believe. Where have you gone, James? Are you here? This lady at the back, sorry, I don't know your name.
Thank you very much. My name is Jessica Shankelman. I'm a journalist from Bloomberg News. I just had a question on a couple of your policies. The one on illegal immigrants. Can you just clarify that if you think there should be a strong message that they won't be allowed to stay, if they are escaping regimes and countries where they're not safe, where should they go? And secondly, on the environment, can you just clarify what you mean about just using trees to tackle climate change? Do you think we should be paying our farmers to plant more trees? Do you think that there is any scope for renewable energy to provide a green industrial revolution, or do you see industry as only the coal and other polluting industries?
I'm going to take the immigration question because you always take it. We make very, very clear in the document that, as the UK always has done, will continue to be a safe haven for genuine refugees. But of course, effectively, you incentivise those who are dishonest to people traffic. And that is something that has led to absolutely tragic outcomes. Of course, it's a very difficult situation, but you cannot have policies that encourage the illegal people traffickers to flourish. That's a really, really dangerous thing.
Yeah, and I mean, we've had since 1951, we've had the definition, the Geneva definition of what is a genuine refugee. And of course, that is somebody who claims that in the first safe country they come to. Now, we've always been prepared to do more than our fair share for genuine refugees, but I'm afraid the European Union made an awful mess of this back in 2015 when they sent a message that said that anybody that set foot on EU soil could stay, and that directly has led to thousands of people drowning in the Mediterranean. It's just as simple and brutal as that. So what we're saying is we, of course, are happy to meet our obligations for genuine refugees, but not to be taken for a ride. And a very simple message, that if you come into this country illegally, through the channel, under the channel, in the back of a container, you will not be allowed to stay. We'll prevent the human tragedy, and then perhaps we can have a genuine debate about who a refugee really is. On the environment, look, if sustainable energy, renewable energy works, that's fantastic. But what we've seen so much of is this extraordinary transference of money from poor to rich. I talked about VAT on domestic fuel. Equally, I could have talked about the £130 a year on every single average family's electricity bill, which goes to pay for renewable energy, which gives, in many cases, landowners hundreds of thousands of pounds a year in income. So far, the way green taxes have worked, it's hurt the poor, it's benefited the rich. I can see there is clearly some great progress being made with offshore wind. There's some real progress being made with solar energy. I'm all for that. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that trees are the answer to everything, but goodness me, isn't it a positive place to start? Wouldn't it show us in the world? I mean, we're losing an area of the Amazon every year that's about the equivalent of Devon and Cornwall put together. And what I'm saying is there's an opportunity here for us to spearhead something on a global stage that I think would pick up massive support, and we can lead it.
Next, Paul McNamara, please.
Hello there, Paul from Channel 4 News. At the moment, we are 47,000 nurses short across England and Scotland alone, not the whole of the UK. We are 60,000 engineering graduates short according to the Federation of Master Builders, 33,500 builders short, and that's just this year alone. It's going to take years, if not decades, to fill these. Your 50,000 number of curbing immigration, it's just pie in the sky, isn't it?
David, do you want to pick up the NHS point first, or are you happy to?
Let David do the NHS.
Yep.
Just on the numbers, thank you for making my point. Thank you. We are not training enough engineers. We are not training enough nurses. We are not training enough doctors. We're very, very keen to get as many of our kids studying ologies as we possibly can, rather than learning genuine trades and skills. And I think we've made some huge mistakes in that area. And let me also, this is very interesting, we've not had a proper debate on this for years, and I think with respect, many have forgotten there is a distinction here. Immigration is when somebody moves to a country, settles in a country, brings their family with them or starts a new life. Work permits are an entirely different thing. When you get a work permit, you are for 6 months or a year or whatever it may be, entitled to go and work in that country. You obviously around the world have to bring your own health insurance, you have to show you haven't got a serious criminal record, you're not entitled to the benefit system, but you can come and work in that country until the day that permit ends. I mean, we need to, I think because of free movement of citizens from the EU, we've lost the distinction between work permits and between people coming and settling. And look, you know, you've highlighted there at the start the glaring problems that we have. We have failed to encourage young people to go into the right skills and trade. We're not pretending for a moment this can be solved overnight. It'll take years to get this right, but let's at least try and get a national debate around making a start. As I say, no, not at all. If that's what you want to do, that's what you can do. And I'm setting it as a rough marker. You know, I'm not saying it's an absolute. I'm saying let's return to 60 years of post-war normality that actually led to us having the best levels of integration of any country in Europe, the best race relations of any country in Europe. We did this incredibly well until the late 1990s when we took a different direction, and we're now paying actually quite a big price for that.
David, we'll just add a couple of points on the...
Perhaps I could just intervene. You know, I'm very proud that I was trained by the NHS. I practiced in the NHS. And I just want to pick up something that has been touted in the press. It's very important the NHS remains free at the point of need. Not free, but free at the point of need. Now, to do that, as Nigel has said, there are huge burdens in terms of morbidity, and we need to staff. One of the biggest problems is we're simply not training enough doctors in this country, and we are not training enough nurses. There is this perversity also that for many locum doctors, of which I was one, the tax, you get taxed so highly, the locums are now not engaging in that work, so that needs to be addressed. Secondly, in terms of nursing, one of the biggest problems has been the introduction of the academic grades into nursing. There are many, many people who are brilliant carers, great handholders, and when I'm sick and when I'm ill, I want someone who holds my hand and looks after me. So we need to introduce a second tier of nursing where people can go in who are great carers. And also, of course, we need to attract the best and the brightest from around the world. So at the moment, because we're in the European Union, we give preferential treatment to European nationals. I would like to see fantastic doctors and nurses coming from countries such as Australia, as New Zealand, as the United States. And this is all about investing in the NHS, which is fit for the future.
Thanks, David. Kate Devlin from The Times. Don't know where you are, Kate, sorry.
Thank you very much. Question for Nigel. You say that Brexit Party is here to stay. Are you here to stay? If you fail to win any seats at this election, will you remain leader or perhaps hand over to someone else and spend more time in America?
I love the bit on the end, that's great. Look, I think as you all know, I was more than happy in 2016 to say I've done my bit, I'm very happy, I've helped push a referendum, I've done my bit towards helping to win it, and that's it, I'm done. Because everyone said they were going to implement the result, so there was nothing to fear. I watched with growing dismay until, back in February this year, I founded the Brexit Party, and thank goodness I did. If I hadn't done it, this wouldn't be happening today because Theresa May would still be Prime Minister. So I think we have made a very big difference with this. I am absolutely committed to the complete reform of our political system. The more I see it at first hand, the more awful I think it is, the more corrupt I think it is, the greater I think the need is to completely revive democracy, faith and trust in this country. And whatever role it's in, I'm going to go on campaigning for years to come on many of the things that are there in that document.
And anyway, we just can't get rid of him. It's ridiculous. Peter Walker from The Guardian.
Hello.
Peter, sorry. Hi.
Just a quick question, Nigel, about what you mean by clean break Brexit. Because it always seemed to be very, very clear that by clean break Brexit, you meant what people meant as either a WTO deal or a no-deal Brexit. But you seem to be indicating now that if Boris Johnson does a kind of Brexit, which is a Canada plus deal, which is not based on any kind of EU regulations, that would also be considered a clean break Brexit. Has the definition changed? And if it has changed, I mean, could that potentially harm your trust with voters who thought clean break Brexit meant one particular thing?
You know, I talked earlier about the fact that I've been in business before coming into politics, and I spent 22 years working in a very international business, the buying and selling and shipping and trading of commodities all over the world, mostly metals. That was what I did. So I came into this with a business background, and I fully understand that it's easier to do business if you don't have tariff. You still do business with tariff, and I mean, the vast majority of world trade is still conducted today on WTO terms. All our trade with China is on WTO terms. All our trade with the USA is on WTO terms. But I have consistently, for 25 years, said I want a genuine free trade agreement with our European neighbours, and that would mean no tariff, and you know, it would mean no quota. A clean break Brexit is not to be aligned to every single new directive that gets ratified through the European institutions. A clean break Brexit means we're not under the auspices and jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and there's no change of definition. I mean, the reason I said we had to leave on the 31st of October on WTO terms is there was no other way of doing it, because we'd been presented with a totally failed negotiation. But look, I stick to what I've said for 25 years. I want a genuine free trade agreement with the European Union. Whether we get that before we leave or whether we get that after we leave doesn't matter to me. Brexit, that vote that everybody tries to talk about in economic terms, that vote was a political decision. We voted to leave the European Union and its institutions, and it's that so far Westminster has completely failed to deliver, and I think that explains much of the breakdown of trust. So no, a clean break means not being under EU rule, not adjudged by their court. It's quite simple.
And if I can add, Peter, being an MEP, it's really clear also with a business background. France and Germany have been very open about it. They are terrified of having a competitor on their, right next door to them. So it's all going to come down to a few months because, as you know, transition extension has to be taken by the end of June. The Prime Minister has been absolutely clear that there will not be an extension of transition. It's Laura from British Forces Broadcasting, I think. Sorry.
Hiya. So the opening shots in your party political broadcast were of the military. You used a veteran in there as an interviewee to try and get your message across, and yet there's nothing in this contract that's actually targeted specifically for them. Both Labour and the Conservatives have come up with policies that would aid them with the problems that they have, but all that's in here about defence is essentially maintaining that 2% of GDP in the budget. What are you going to do?
Okay. So
That's fine. There's a very, very deliberate reason for that, and that is that on the 2nd of December, the NATO summit starts. At the moment, we are conducting a general election with no discussion about the European Defence Union, no discussion about our role and involvement in it, no discussion about the willful dangers that NATO faces, and you just have to look at what Monsieur Macron says, what my friend Mr Verhofstadt says, even Mr Juncker says. They all say we can't rely on the Americans anymore, therefore we have to have our own European Defence Union. It must be completed by 2025, and we must use it. We've got muscle, we must use it. In fact, much of what has been said in normal political circumstances would have been horrifying. It's been brushed under the carpet. And here's my problem with it. My problem with it is the withdrawal agreement does not take us out of the European Defence Union. I do want to have a debate about the European Army during this general election. I do want to have a debate about the Five Eyes intelligence network, which we rely upon so much. And I've deliberately chosen not to put it in here today because I felt, apart from you, it would have got lost. But when President Trump arrives on the 2nd of December, we're going to have 3 days when we are talking about NATO, where we are talking about defence, and I will say a lot more on that subject then.
Surely you need some kind of idea about how you'd set up the armed forces, how you'd use defence, because currently numbers are down and we do need support from other nations in order to defend ourselves. And if you're talking about sovereignty and leaving with a clean break, you need that plan.
I think to be honest with you, and again, as I say, we'll do this in a couple of weeks' time, but I honestly think we face a choice now. Do we stick with Five Eyes? Do we stick with NATO? Or do we see the emerging European Defence and Security Union as the way forward? I don't think we can go on doing both. I think we have to make a big strategic decision here. Very happy in a couple of weeks' time to talk to you in length about that. And I hope that it's a subject that the public start to think about and start to talk about. At the moment, the others refuse to discuss it. Don't worry, I will be.
And we'll finish off with a question from Andy from Channel 5.
Thank you. Andy Bell, 5 News. Mr Farage, do you really want what could possibly be your last big decision on the national political stage to be to deprive the Conservatives of majority at this election and open the way to another referendum? Do you really want that to be your legacy?
It's a shame you chaps haven't got very good memories because, as I've said to you already, there was no doubt in 2015 that the impact on some of Labour's key target seats in England, where we saw UKIP scores of 8, 9, 10,000 votes, and suddenly you saw Conservatives increase their majorities. It's difficult perhaps for many in Westminster and London. There are millions of Labour voters out there who will never vote Conservative. They cannot bring themselves to vote Conservative. They never will do so, but they will vote for the Brexit Party. And I make the point that in our key seats, we are the challengers to the incumbent Labour Party, and we will say to Conservative leavers in those seats, don't waste your votes, lend your vote to the Brexit Party, get us in the House of Commons, and we will keep Boris Johnson, who they like. I mean, Conservative voters like Boris Johnson. They're just not always too sure whether they can 100% trust him. And there'll be other constituencies in which the Conservatives will be the challengers, where you will look at all of this on the morning of the 13th of December and say, wow, there's only one reason the Conservatives won that seat. That's because the Brexit Party dug so deep into Labour. We saw it in 2015. It's playing out again now. It's a false narrative. It's an old narrative. It doesn't work.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining us this morning. We'll be doing other press, I'm sure, straight after the formal part here. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Guys.